What's interesting about this presentation is the hardest thing for people to get their head around sometimes is when you're talking about managing water, you're talking about a resource that doesn't stay still. It's not managing a rock and it's not managing a cavern. I mean, basically our water resource continues to move, and as it moves, it intersects different parts of our lives, it intersects different regulatory patterns, and that on Long Island and many other places is why water management is such a difficult thing to do. Now, to think about Long Island a little bit, one of the things to just keep in mind is how we got here. And, there's a lot of ways to describe Long Island, and people talk about glaciers. I always talk about taking a flat piece of wood and basically taking a bucket full of sand and gravel and slowly letting it go out across that piece of wood, and then letting water run across that sand, on and on and on. And what eventually happens is some of the heavier material stays in the middle, some of the finer material goes out along the side, and in a geologic sense, that's what happened with Long Island. And the reason that's interesting is because, as most people know, if you take a cup full of sand and you throw some water in it, that water moves all throughout that sand. And so here on Long Island, everything with respect to water is really connected to everything else. The water underneath our feet finds its way to the bays. The water that basically comes off our roads finds its way to the bays. Whatever is going on in one part of the island can show up someplace else. And that's important when you start talking about water management. Many people know that we have a water cycle on Long Island like we do every place else, but here, that water cycle, usually from top to bottom, brings all sorts of materials with it down into our aquifers, which are really just unconsolidated sands and gravels. But anything that's on the soil has a way of getting underneath. And once it's underneath, you don't see it, you don't think about it, and it just keeps moving. And what we're finding more and more is that the end result, where that water ends up in our bays and harbors, is a really important management issue. Now, Long Island's interesting in another respect because when Long Island was developed, it developed extremely rapidly. One of the things that you can see is when the railroads got out to Long Island, very shortly thereafter, the landscape changed dramatically, and it changed forever. It was beautiful, it was easy to access from New York, and maybe more than anything else, I come from an area which is full of rocks and ledges and things like this. There were almost no impediments to development on Long Island. Sand and gravel moves very easily, and that makes for development that happens very quickly, and it allows us to do all kinds of things in a hurry that if you were in another area, you might have to take more time. And folks don't think about that, but if you think about, again, from a management perspective, how quickly you can build houses and roads and how quickly you can occupy communities sometimes sells short the long-term implications just because it's so easy to do. And many people who live on Long Island are familiar with Levittown, which at one time was the fastest growing suburb in the entire country. And many people think of it now that it's all built and full of trees, but at one time it looked like this. It really was just a crisscross pattern of roadways with chock-a-block houses, and they were wonderful and provided places for people to live. But at the same time, all of that development happening so quickly never reflected really what was going on underneath. But as Long Island developed, what happens once you occupy a community, whatever comes off your car, whatever drains out of a septic system, whatever you may put on the ground as a fertilizer, is all going through that same process. It's going down below, it's finding its way into the water, and so Long Island, in not too short a period of time, and even Brooklyn and Queens, started having water quality problems, primarily things that people were pulling up in their wells. And, here on the island, there's a couple of interesting things. We had these great duck farms that people sometimes don't even know about anymore, but we had hundreds of thousands of ducks being grown here. And those duck farms were some of the first visible signs that we had of water quality problems here on Long Island. We also had, gotten rid of our sewage pretty much in, Roman technology. You put a hole in the ground, you put your sewage in the hole, and as long as it drains, seems to be working. Early on, the principal concern about sewage was health implications. I don't want to get cholera, I don't want to get typhoid. We didn't think about the relationship between nutrients in that wastewater and where all that was going. So those issues on Long Island, and also the demand in New York City, which very quickly began to use up all of the fresh water that was available, made Suffolk County and Nassau County concerned pretty early about where their water was going to come from and how much New York might be able to take. Going back as early as the 1930s, Suffolk County started to figure out that if it didn't do something to protect its water resources, they might well be all drained off to go to New York City. And it created the Suffolk County Water Authority, which today is the largest water supplier here on Long Island. But very early on, their real job was to protect that resource for the future. Now, of course, they're in the distribution business and they have wells and so forth. But the first thing was to make sure that we could sort of keep what was underneath us. 10 years after they were created, and we started seeing more things happening with our wells, the U.S. Geologic Survey came in and started looking at Long Island's water, a federal agency trying to figure out where did the water go and how did it move, and things that we think about and take for granted today really weren't known. As water quality continued to decline in surface waters in the 1950s, Woods Hole was brought in to basically do a study, and I believe it was the towns of Brookhaven and Islip that joined together to bring them here. And what they came to realize was that the water was starting to go downhill in the 1940s and the 1950s. A lot of it related to duck farms, but that wasn't the full story, and it took a while until we learned more about that. When you get to the 1950s, Suffolk County Health Department, which basically was responsible for keeping us from getting, typhoid and cholera, also got pulled into the issues of the health of bays and estuaries, primarily because of duck farms. And these duck farms were continuing to be a problem for everybody who was looking at the bays and living on the bays, and their responsibility for public health broadened earlier than many public health departments into what we now call environmental health. By the 1960s, the Suffolk County Legislature gets created, and the Suffolk County Legislature for the first time is looking regionally. Now, we had boards of supervisors before that, and Nassau County later on came out with its legislature. And a board of supervisors looks at things a little bit differently. They take more of a town perspective, and of course they work together on certain things. But a county legislature really looks over the entire landscape. And shortly after they were created, the concern about managing all of our septic waste from all the development that was continuing was very real. And so the Suffolk County Sewer Agency was created as the first municipal agency in Suffolk County to try to manage how we were going to take our treated wastewater, where we were going to take it. And fortunately, shortly thereafter, the Federal Clean Water Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level, the creation of the Department of Environmental Conservation at the state level, all came together to try to find ways to better manage this resource. But what I'm getting to is all of these different agencies appeared usually around a particular problem and were given a particular responsibility. And then another problem would arise, and then some other agency would be working on that problem. And all of this was good and important, but it didn't really integrate how they worked together. And then the last little box you'll see in the image here are just a few. These are East End town symbols, but you could have them all across Long Island. Towns and villages from the late 1950s right on up through today began using planning and zoning tools to try to protect their natural resources, whether they were wetlands or beaches or even groundwater quality. Some of the towns in Suffolk County proved to have some of the most progressive land use protection policies through their zoning, and they were another layer trying to look at water resources. Now, yeah, we had a lot of bureaucracy, but did we get anything done? And the answer is we got a lot done. So why are we giving this presentation? Well, here's the basic problem. This slide pretty much shows you the vertical ascent of population. This is Suffolk County, but you could pretty much say all of Long Island since 1900 up through today. And that number of people doing whatever it is that we do on the land, whether it's driving our cars or filling our household fuel tanks or using fertilizers or using pesticides or draining our waste into septic systems, it all adds up. So all of the work that we've done in the last 35 and 40 years is great work. Thank God we did it. But this pace of development has not been equaled by our response to it. And so where we end up is we still have some major consequences to deal with. Today we have 350,000 on-site wastewater systems, home systems. We now know that the science is telling us that those systems are contributing too much nitrogen to our bays and harbors, and that's causing toxic and harmful algal blooms, which is not good for the life that lives there. We also lack standards to protect ecological and human health. This is the next generation of water management. We don't have the right standards to know how to take care of those water bodies in a way other than drinking water or a way that would be important for just human health. There's more evidence that our society has created things that weren't here. We have pharmaceutical products. Personal care products are going down the drain. They're getting out into the water. We still have newer pesticides, but some of those pesticides are now showing up in the water. Even pesticides that weren't supposed to show up in the water are showing up in the water. There's illegal dumping and contamination. When you close the landfills, that was a good thing, but there's still people who need to get rid of stuff, and they don't always do it in the right way, and that ends up finding its way onto the ground and into the water. There is ceaseless development pressure all over the place. Long Island, no matter what the economy is, there is always development pressure in Long Island, and the more you develop, the more opportunities for contamination that you have. And many governments have been through very tough fiscal times of late. Those tough fiscal times lead to all kinds of cuts in the programs that protect water resources. And so you have that graph that I showed you before, and you could have a graph going the opposite way for the amount of investment in the public health officials and environmental people we need to keep track. That's a big problem. Sea level rise is another issue. Sea level rise affects lots of things: saltwater intrusion for our public drinking water wells, poor flushing for wastewater flow. And at the bottom of all of it really is kind of a confusing regulatory structure. Who's in charge of what piece of this problem, and how do we build a 21st century regulatory structure that is simple, easy, and basically addresses these issues comprehensively? We don't have that yet. So what do we do now? Well, it's long been said, Lu Tsao, the Chinese philosopher, has this great line: if we don't change direction, we'll probably end up where we're heading. Well, where we're heading is into these choppy waters and maybe more, but I'm extremely pleased that in the last 3 years, tremendous motion has taken place to get us back on the right track for water quality protection. Right now, after 15 years, the Suffolk County Health Department has come out with its latest comprehensive water resources plan. That is great baseline information about what we need to do and how we need to do it to protect water. The Long Island Commission for Aquifer Protection is working on a State of the Aquifer report. That's a requirement to tell us how much water we have, where is that water, how does it get distributed, what are the risks. We now have a Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan, which is coming out of the state of New York, and that's going to help us figure out what I said before, which is who should be in charge, what are the numbers of nitrogen that we're talking about for ecological as well as human health, and how do we create a regulatory system, any kind of a management system, to get that water back to what it was when most of us were kids and enjoyed fishing and clamming and all of that, which is so important to our economy. If you think about the billions of dollars lost because you can't shellfish or people don't want to go fishing, investments in clean water always turn out to be good investments in the economy. We also have Stony Brook's new University Center for Clean Water Technology, a research component which will help us understand better wastewater systems, how those systems can be used to reduce nitrogen on the home front. And added to those efforts is really the need for some more government innovation. IBM came to Suffolk County recently, and they did an analysis of what the county's issues were. They looked at the water issue, and they concluded that, you got to have somebody who's responsible for this, a management entity that is going to oversee all of these complicated processes if you want to get an efficient outcome that cleans up the water. We need to have more varied technologies than we currently have. We have to bring those technologies to market. And the Center for Clean Water Technology is one institution that's trying to have that happen more quickly and create a market, as well as a potential great economic development opportunity there for folks making those systems. We also have to get our nitrogen reduction goals, which are different sometimes by each individual watershed based on what's going on the land. This is new thinking, but it can be done, and it is being done. And then we have to integrate the data that all the agencies currently possess into one area so that we're all working off essentially the same map. And we're going to need revenue to get this done. We need recurring revenue. So a one-shot revenue is not going to do it. But there are efforts, and one of them we could talk about is, on the East End 15 years ago, when land was disappearing faster than ever before, we created something called the Community Preservation Fund. And the Community Preservation Fund has raised $1 billion in recurring revenue for land protection, and it's saved thousands of acres from development. And the public voted for it over and over again because they knew what the outcome was going to be. And we need that sort of thing when it comes to wastewater as well. And then, all throughout this process, we're going to have people remaining interested in the issue of clean water. Public policy and politicians are driven by the things that people bring to them every single day. And if every single day you open up Newsday and there's a story about water and somebody calls you on the phone and they're asking about water and you're at a public hearing and people are concerned about water, that moves this issue to the top of the public agenda, and it has to stay there because you can't fix this in a weekend. So we're going to have to, all of us who do this kind of work, and there's lots of people well beyond me doing this in all communities across Long Island, which is also good news. We need to keep it on the top of the agenda of all of our elected officials.